What should have been an ordinary family trip. A mother, devoted and protective. A 6-year-old boy, brimming with energy and wonder. Together, they left the safety of their home in New Zealand to explore the wider world. Just a short trip, a taste of adventure. Canada, with its natural beauty and reputation for kindness, seemed like the perfect destination. Nothing about their journey suggested danger. Nothing about their story, at first, hinted at tragedy. But what unfolded was anything but ordinary. Somewhere between borders, between bureaucracy and suspicion, their family trip spiraled into a nightmare. Instead of returning home to loved ones, instead of posting photographs of their travels, they found themselves confined, detained in the custody of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, better known as ICE. Weeks stretched into an ordeal they could never have anticipated. Headlines began to surface. Asterisk, a New Zealand mother and her 6-year-old son detained. Asterisk, each word carried weight. Each word echoed with fear and uncertainty. Who were they? Why were they being held? And how does a simple trip to Canada end with a child and his mother trapped in the machinery of U.S. immigration enforcement? This is not just a story of travel gone wrong. It is not just another case buried beneath mountains of policy and procedure. This is a story about innocence colliding with suspicion, about motherhood under siege, and about the devastating human cost when systems fail. The mother's voice, pleading through legal filings and interviews, paints a picture of desperation. I just want my son to be safe. I just want us to go home. The child, only 6, could not possibly grasp the weight of immigration law or international jurisdiction. Yet he lived its consequences. The nights in detention, the separation from normal life, the confusion and fear, it was all his reality. To understand how this happened, we must trace their steps back to the beginning. What began as a simple border crossing would escalate into a labyrinth of suspicion, legal battles, and unanswered questions. Authorities claimed inconsistencies in their story. Advocates argued this was an unjust detention of an innocent family. And through it all, one haunting question remains. How does a mother and child, citizens of a peaceful nation, end up trapped thousands of miles from home, caught in the shadow of one of the world's most controversial enforcement agencies? This is their story, and it begins in the most unexpected of places, on what was meant to be a brief trip to Canada. She was an ordinary woman by every measure, the kind of person you might pass on the street and not think twice about. A mother devoted to her son, cautious but hopeful, carrying the weight of responsibility that all parents feel when traveling abroad. Her name has been withheld in many reports, an anonymity that underscores the vulnerability of her situation. But behind that anonymity is a real person, a real child. They boarded a plane from New Zealand bound for Canada. It was not a relocation, not an attempt to leave their life behind, but a short trip. Some called it a vacation. Others suggested it may have been a visit with friends or a distant family. Whatever the reason, it was meant to last only days. A brief chapter in their lives. Canada welcomed them in. There were no alarms, no raised suspicions, nothing that would suggest danger was looming. For a few days, the mother and her son lived the kind of ordinary joys that come with travel. The boy laughed at the novelty of being somewhere new. He clutched his mother's hand tightly as they walked through unfamiliar streets, safe in the unspoken trust between parent and child. She, in turn, carried the quiet satisfaction of giving him the gift of experience, of showing him a world beyond their small corner of New Zealand. But behind the warmth of those moments, forces were already aligning against them, because the world is not so simple when it comes to borders. Every crossing is a question. Every stamp in a passport is a judgment. And somewhere, somehow, their story did not align with what officials expected. When they attempted to cross into the United States, something shifted. Reports indicate that their paperwork raised red flags. Authorities suspected their story wasn't adding up, that what was presented as a short visit might have been an attempt at something more permanent. It was never proven. It was never clear. But in the eyes of U.S. immigration officials, suspicion alone is enough to halt lives in their tracks. It began with questions. Where were they staying? How long did they intend to remain? Why was their itinerary so vague? For the mother, these were routine inquiries. For ICE, they were warning signs. And once the suspicion was raised, there was no turning back. Within hours, their trip to Canada was overshadowed by the grim reality of detention. The boy, only 6, clung to his mother as officials led them away. To him, it must have felt confusing, surreal. Adults in uniform speaking in stern voices. His mother's face tight with fear, but trying desperately to stay calm for his sake. This was the moment their trip transformed into something darker. What was meant to be a fleeting memory of joy became the beginning of weeks in custody, trapped in the liminal space of U.S. immigration detention, where the rules are rigid but the outcomes are unpredictable. For most people, detention is an abstract idea. It's something read about in headlines, debated in politics, glimpsed in brief television clips. But for this mother and her 6-year-old child, it was no longer abstract. It was real. It was immediate. It was terrifying. They were taken into custody by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, a name that, for many around the world, evokes fear, uncertainty, and controversy. For a mother traveling with her child, it evoked something else, helplessness. Because once you are in ICE custody, you are no longer in control of your life. Officials insisted that the decision was by the book. Their documentation did not satisfy the requirements. Their intent to travel raised concerns. We have procedures, one immigration spokesperson noted. When there are discrepancies, we act accordingly. Cold words, mechanical words. For the mother, those words translated into metal doors locking behind her. For her son, it meant sleeping on a thin mat in a room filled with strangers, the air heavy with confusion and fear. Reports from detainees often described the facilities in stark terms. Fluorescent lights that never dim, temperatures kept cold enough to make sleep difficult, meals that barely satisfy hunger. For adults, it is punishing. For children, it is unbearable. The boy, just 6 years old, found himself thrust into a world that no child should ever have to experience. An environment where laughter fades, replaced by whispered reassurances from mothers trying to comfort their children while hiding their own terror. The mother did what any parent would do. She tried to stay strong. She told him it would be okay. She told him it was temporary. But as the hours turned into days and the days into weeks, those reassurances began to crack. Outside, the world began to take notice. A case like this, a mother and child, 4 nationals detained not for crimes, but for paperwork, sparked questions. Journalists began asking, why was ICE holding a woman and her young son who posed no apparent threat? Human rights advocates raised alarms, pointing out that international law protects children from prolonged detention, and yet here was a 6-year-old boy spending night after night behind locked doors. An official statement was brief, almost dismissive. All individuals entering the United States must comply with immigration law. It read, when individuals are found to be in violation, they may be detained until further determination. No acknowledgement of the child. No mention of the weeks stretching endlessly forward. Inside, time worked. For the mother, days blurred together in a haze of uncertainty. She worried about her son's health, about the food, about the constant cold, about the psychological toll. She worried about herself too, but mothers often put themselves last. Her only priority was protecting him, even in a place where her power to do so was stripped away. And in the silence of detention, in the long nights where hope felt distant, a deeper question lingered. Was this truly about protecting borders, or had bureaucracy swallowed compassion whole? The human spirit is resilient, but it is not unbreakable. By the 3rd week of detention, cracks began to show. The boy cried more often. At first, quietly, muffled sobs pressed into his mother's shoulder. But as the days passed, his crying grew louder, sharper, filled with frustration he could not put into words. A 6-year-old does not understand immigration policy. A 6-year-old only understands freedom and the sudden, devastating absence of it. His mother's strength was tested daily. Every time she lined up for meals, every time she was escorted under the watchful eyes of officers, every time her son asked the same desperate question, when can we go home? Her resolve weakened. She tried to hide her tears from him, waiting until he fell asleep before she let herself break. But even in sleep, the child stirred, his small body restless, his dreams interrupted by the cold reality of confinement. Word of their case began to spread beyond the sterile walls of IC. Activists demanded answers. Human rights attorneys described detention as deeply troubling and a violation of both the spirit and the letter of international child protection standards. One advocate stated bluntly, "We are not talking about criminals. We're talking about a mother and her son who wanted to visit country, and they are being treated as though they are dangerous." News outlets began picking up fragments of the story. Headlines questioned the necessity of holding a child for weeks on end. Editorials drew sharp contrasts. A democratic nation known for values of freedom, now keeping a 6-year-old boy behind locked doors. Even some officials admitted privately that the optics were damaging. But policy, one set in motion, is a machine that does not stop easily. Inside detention, the mother clung to hope that someone, somewhere, would intervene. She asked officers for updates, but the answers were always vague. "It's being reviewed. There's nothing we can say yet." Days dragged on, bureaucracy moving at its slowest, while a clock ticked endlessly for her and her son. And then something shifted. A coalition of lawyers took up her case, filing urgent petitions. Public pressure mounted, amplified by social media. Ordinary people, mothers, fathers, families who saw themselves in her plight, demanded release. It was no longer just a quiet tragedy unfolding behind closed doors. It was a story the world was beginning to watch. And with every new headline, with every new outcry, the walls of detention seemed to close in tighter, pushing the situation toward a breaking point. What began as a quiet detention was now an unfolding international incident. Lawyers representing the mother and her son filed urgent motions, arguing that prolonged detention of a child violated not only U.S. law, but also international conventions protecting minors. One attorney declared, "Every single day this child remains behind bars is a day the system has failed its most basic duty to protect the vulnerable." Pressure was mounting on multiple fronts. Calls flooded congressional offices. Human rights organizations issued public statements, and online campaigns spread rapidly. Petitions gathered thousands of signatures. The story had struck a nerve because it wasn't abstract. It was visceral. The image of a 6-year-old boy behind the gates of an IC facility stirred outrage and heartbreak in equal measure. Officials inside the detention system faced a dilemma. On one hand, strict adherence to immigration protocol dictated that both mother and child remain in custody until their status was resolved. On the other, the glare of media attention and public anger made continued detention increasingly difficult to justify. This is no longer just about one family. One official admitted anonymously, "This has become a test of how we balance enforcement with humanity." For the mother, the outside world's growing awareness was both a lifeline and a torment. She began to hear whispers that people were fighting for her, that lawyers were working tirelessly on her behalf. But inside, the conditions did not change. Each morning, she woke up to the same walls, the same lines, the same uncertainty. The boy continued to ask questions she could not answer. "Are we leaving today? Did they say yes?" Every "not yet" broke her heart a little more. Meanwhile, supporters dug deeper into the details of the case. Why had a routine trip turned into weeks of incarceration? Was this an error, or was it policy applied with cold precision? Commentators began to draw parallels to other controversial detentions, framing this case as part of a larger systemic problem. The courtroom became the next battlefield. Hearings were scheduled. Lawyers argued that ICE's continued detention was unnecessary, unreasonable, and harmful. The government, in turn, defended its authority to enforce immigration law strictly. It was a clash between two visions, one emphasizing security and control, the other emphasizing compassion and justice. As arguments intensified, the case hovered in limbo. The mother and son remained detained, suspended in a strange twilight between freedom and confinement, while the outside world debated their fate. But beneath the legal language and political rhetoric, the human cost continued to mount. The boy's drawings, once cheerful, filled with bright skies and trees, grew darker. Stick figures behind fences, clouds that blocked out the sun. The innocence of a child was being slowly reshaped by the reality of detention. It was becoming clear that a resolution had to come soon. The question was not if, but how, and at what cost. The pressure reached a boiling point. Weeks had passed, and the story of a New Zealand mother and her 6-year-old son was no longer confined to corners of immigration law or quiet legal filings. It was on the front pages, in primetime broadcasts, and across every major platform online. Journalists used stark, uncompromising language. A child behind bars. A mother treated as a criminal for traveling. The optics were devastating. Behind closed doors, officials knew something had to give. One IC officer, speaking under condition of anonymity, admitted we were being watched. Every move we made was scrutinized. There was no way to quietly process this case anymore. For the mother, days felt like years. Her health was deteriorating under the stress, and the constant fear for her son gnawed at her every waking moment. The boy, once restless and confused, had become strangely quiet. He clung to his mother's hand, refusing to let go even for a moment. His silence was not peace. It was exhaustion. Lawyers pressed harder. They submitted medical reports, psychological evaluations, and expert testimony outlining the irreparable harm detention could cause to a child so young. One psychologist stated plainly, a child's developing brain is not built to withstand the trauma of prolonged incarceration. What is being done here will leave scars that may never heal. In the courtroom, judges were faced with more than just paperwork. They were faced with the undeniable reality that a child was suffering. The legal arguments were no longer abstract. Every word carried the weight of a boy's well-being. And outside the courthouse, crowds gathered. Protesters held signs that read, "Children don't belong in cages, and free them now." Their chants echoed through the city streets, demanding justice. The breaking point came when international media picked up the story in full force. Headlines in New Zealand and Canada put pressure on U.S. diplomats. Human rights organizations condemned the detention as a violation of international law. Even foreign government officials began quietly inquiring why their citizen and her young son were still behind bars after weeks of waiting. Under this mounting scrutiny, the machinery of bureaucracy began to shift. Meetings were held late into the night. Memos circulated between agencies. Calls were made from Washington to the local IC field office. The case was no longer routine. It was political. Finally, whispers began to circulate that a decision was imminent, that freedom might be within reach. For the mother and her son, hope flickered again, fragile, uncertain, but alive. But with hope came fear, because in cases like this, nothing was guaranteed. A decision could bring freedom, or it could bring deportation. Either way, their lives were about to change forever. The world was watching, and the moment of truth was drawing near. The hearing room was tense. Lawyers shuffled papers. ICE representatives sat stiff-backed, and the mother clutched her son's hand, as though letting go would mean losing him forever. This was the day when weeks of fear, legal battles, and international pressure would collide in a single decision. The judge looked weary but focused, the weight of public scrutiny clear in their measured tone. For hours, arguments were laid bare. The government cited security protocols, insisting procedures had been followed. The defense countered with raw humanity, reminding the court that behind the case file was a child, 6 years old, innocent, and undeserving of detention. Quotes from past rulings echoed through the room. Children should not be treated as collateral in immigration disputes. The defense leaned on those precedents, pressing the point again and again. This was not about bending rules, but about protecting life. The mother sat silently, tears streaming down her face, as she listened to strangers decide her future. Her son, too young to understand the legal jargon, simply whispered, "Are we going home, Mommy?" His voice cracked the room's armor of formality. It was no longer possible to ignore the human cost. When the judge finally spoke, the silence was absolute. Every word was deliberate. The prolonged detention of this child is not justified. Release is hereby granted. The room seemed to exhale at once. The mother collapsed forward, clutching her son tightly. Lawyers patted her back, relief breaking across their faces. The boy, confused but sensing his mother's joy, smile for the first time in weeks. But the victory was not without shadow. The ruling did not erase the trauma already inflicted, nor did it guarantee long-term stability. Questions still lingered. Would they be allowed to stay in the U.S.? Would they be deported to New Zealand? What scars would remain after this ordeal? Outside, cameras flashed. Protesters cheered. Reporters rushed to file breaking news updates. Mother and child freed after weeks in icy detention. International outlets picked up the story within minutes, framing it as both a relief and an indictment of the system that had allowed it to happen in the first place. For the mother, freedom was sweet, but it was also fragile. She knew this was only the end of one chapter. Ahead lay more legal battles, more uncertainty, more rebuilding. And yet, for the first time in weeks, she walked out of detention holding her son's hand, not through steel bars, but into the open air. The nightmare had reached its climax, but the story was far from over. If this story moved you, please take a moment to share it. The more people who hear stories like these, the harder they are to ignore. And if you want to follow more cases like this, stories of resilience, of injustice, of unanswered questions, consider subscribing. Together, we can make sure these voices are not forgotten. In the days that followed their release, the headlines shifted tone. What had begun as a quiet bureaucratic detention had exploded into an international story about justice, dignity, and the treatment of the vulnerable. For the mother, the verdict was simple. She was free, her son was free, and the bars that had defined their days were behind them. Yet beneath that relief was an undeniable truth. The scars of detention remained. Psychologists who studied cases like hers often warned of the long-term impact on children. The boy, only 6, had spent formative weeks inside a facility meant for holding, not nurturing. He had seen his mother cry through the night. He had asked questions no child should have to ask. Did I do something wrong? The answer, of course, was no. But the echoes of fear do not fade easily. For the legal community, the verdict was both a triumph and a cautionary tale. Advocates declared the decision proof that persistence, public pressure, and legal precision could overcome even the most rigid of systems. But they also warned that countless other families remained in similar conditions. Families without lawyers, without media coverage, without a country rallying behind them. Quotes circulated from a hearing, now immortalized in the press. One attorney was recorded saying, "This case is not just about one mother and one child. It is about the standard we set for humanity itself." Those words reverberated beyond the courtroom, sparking debates in policy circles, universities, and international forums. The verdict became more than a legal outcome. It became a symbol. To some, it was proof that the system could correct itself under pressure. To others, it was evidence of deep flaws, that it required public outrage and media scrutiny to compel compassion. For the mother, the verdict was not about politics. It was about survival. Each morning after her release, she woke up and looked at her son not through glass or steel, but in the soft light of freedom. She cooked him meals, tucked him into bed, and whispered that everything would be okay, even if she wasn't sure of it herself. And yet, the unanswered questions lingered like shadows. Why had they been detained so long? Why had protocols been applied so rigidly to a case that clearly involved no threat? What would happen to the countless others still waiting behind those walls? The final verdict in the eyes of the public was clear. The case had exposed something larger than itself. It had forced a confrontation between law and conscience, between procedure and humanity. And though the mother and child walked free, the story carved itself into the collective memory as a reminder. Justice delayed is not justice denied, but it is justice scarred. The world moved on to new headlines, new crises. But for those who followed this story, the image remained. A mother's hand clutching her son's as they stepped into the open air, fragile, uncertain, but free. In the end, this was not just a story of one woman and her child caught in the machinery of immigration enforcement. It was a story about borders, visible and invisible, about the fragile line between safety and confinement, about how quickly an ordinary journey can turn into a nightmare, and how much courage it takes to keep hope alive when the walls seem unbreakable. For weeks, a mother and her son lived in the shadow of uncertainty, trapped in a system that could not see their humanity, only their paperwork. And yet, Through resilience, advocacy, and the glare of public attention, they emerged, not unscarred, not unchanged, but free. Their release does not erase the memory of locked doors, sleepless nights, or a child's quiet confusion. It does not answer the questions left behind, but it stands as proof that voices matter, that stories matter, that even in the most bureaucratic of systems, compassion can be forced to the surface. As the world turns attention elsewhere, their story faded from headlines. But for those who listened closely, who looked beyond the official statements and statistics, it left behind a haunting reminder. No system is infallible, no law is beyond question, and no child should ever learn the way to change before they learn the weight of innocence. So, what remains is not just a legal outcome, but challenge. A challenge to remember their faces, their struggle, and to ask, how many others still wait, unheard, unseen, in the silence of detention? Because sometimes the hardest part of freedom is realizing how many are still waiting for theirs.